Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning or good evening for some of you. Glad to be with you today, and it's the first time I think we do a video call and presentation about GCVE programs and initiative. So I'm glad to see many people today. So the session will be recorded, and we will explain a bit about the background of GCVE and for the one that are interested on how to become a GNA, and we'll explain a bit about the different concept and so on within the GCVE project. So maybe something that is important and that was like I would say long discussion, I would say the past weeks and even months about who is behind GCVE. As mentioned on the website, is actually Circle, and we have other contributors too. So we are basically leading the project, and the reason behind is due to the fact that we are developing a lot of open source tooling. We were discovering, especially for one of the tools that we were developing called Vulnerability Lookup, which is an open source project to manage vulnerabilities, which basically supports the complete process of vulnerability disclosures from the publication, collection, searching up to the distribution and publications. We discovered that we had some issues regarding the ID allocations, and the reason behind is we have seen over the time that the ecosystems of vulnerability disclosures split into multiple different sources through CSAF, for example, where some providers are actually providing and publishing their own and various different sources. So we actually identified, and this one is not new, I think we identified that even already last year, that we wanted to have a kind of simpler way to facilitate the allocation of IDs and especially identifiers for vulnerabilities. And we wanted to have a system and something that would help organizations that are actually publishing vulnerabilities to facilitate the process. And that's actually what we came with is GCVE. So there are existing programs, like one of the most well-known one is actually the CVE program with CNA process structures for providing structure and constituency on publishing and so on. It's a process that works quite well too, but what we wanted to do is basically to extend the ability there to support other way of publication and so on. And recently we saw that there were some questions from various organizations about the resilience of such systems, of identification and so on. And we wanted to be sure that if we design something that it will be resilient and it will be especially independent from any geopolitical challenges. So for the one that are curious and doesn't know about the background of the software that we are developing at Circle, and especially Vulnerability Lookup, which is actually the tool which is an reference implementations of the GCVE program. So I advise you to have a look at it and look at our instances and so on, and you will see it. I will do a quick demo of the Vulnerability Lookup implementation of the GCVE, so like that you can see how it's implemented, and if you want to re-implement it in another tools, you can actually do it. So what is actually the objective and the role of GCVE? It's very, very simple. It's basically to provide a globally unique identifier, and even to be a bit more precise, the primary goal is to provide a globally unique identifier prefixes. So that means we want to facilitate the creations of global unique identifier and prefixes for authority that can publish vulnerabilities. What we call GNA, so those GNA are called GCVE numbering authorities. The thing is, for the GCVE, we don't actually control the GNAs. They are operating autonomously. They have full control over what they assign and how they manage the identifier, meaning that the ID that they even allocate or pre-allocate or even allocate from archive contents or whatever, it's basically their responsibility. So we just allow the prefix, we allocate the prefix and so on. Nevertheless, what we do, we publish what we call BCP, so kind of best current practices. We have actually 3 of them that are published, and I will come back on that later. And those one are actually providing guidance, best practices and so on. And sometimes I would say must requirement for specific things, including directory management. So for example, to verify the signatures of the directory. We have best practices document for the CVD processes, so coordinated vulnerability disclosure processes, and the publication protocols. Other BCP are foreseen, But those one are quite a flexible system for ensuring publication of vulnerabilities. And the role of GCVE, and I think this one is really one of the key roles of the GCVE part, we actually maintain and publish an official directory of GNA, including publication endpoints if they have some. And that's something that is important too. I will come back to that. How to allow distributed publications of vulnerabilities is actually, if you have a directory, you can basically publish endpoints for publications. I will come back to the standard and how we implemented it in vulnerability lookup, but that's something that can be actually implemented in other software. So that's actually the role. So you see, it's not like a very complex system. It's really, you have to see the GCV initiative as a system allocating prefixes and providing best current practices. That's, I would say, the main goal of the GCV. So if we look from an overview perspective, the GCV directory is actually allocating GCV prefixes. The GCV number authority are doing the publications. So meaning that the GCV directory is not actually doing publications. We could, in maybe long terms, aggregate all the publications from the different GNA for sure, but the end responsibility for the publication of vulnerabilities will be done by the GNA. And the idea behind is when you publish, it's accessible to everyone, either using automation tools like vulnerability lookup, which is a reference implementations, or any other tools, or even user or user interface to access the different vulnerability informations. So another question is like, yeah, but if I want to be GNA, is there any specific, I would say, requirements or conditions to be GNA? There are some minimal conditions. There's an easy one. So if you are already CNA, you can just request a GNA ID and that's it. There's no additional requirements. But then if you are not CNA, which is totally fine too, you need to have at least one of the following conditions. You'll see that there's a small trick here because one of the conditions is pretty easy to have. So for example, if you're a member of CCIRT networks, could be a registered CCIRT on first.org associations, part of the European CCIRT networks, part of the TF CCIRT, you can become a GNA. You just make a request. If you want to make a request, it's through email to gna@gcve.eu. But the thing is not only that. So if you are an existing software, hardware, service provider that actually regularly disclose vulnerabilities, for example, for your own products, services, and so on, you can become GNA. And then there is another case. So if you have a public vulnerability disclosure policy and maintain a public accessible source for newly discovered vulnerabilities, you can become GNA. And I think that's a kind of, I would say, fallback scenario, but I think this one is quite common for a lot of security researchers, for example. We have already some GNA that are actually security researchers that have a kind of group for disclosing vulnerabilities and so on. They are totally eligible for becoming a GNA. In the future, we might be even a bit more flexible on that, but we have seen that until now, those conditions, so if you meet one of the conditions, you can become a GNA, are pretty easy. So you make a request, you can make even a proposal for the IDs if you don't want a sequential ID allocated. So if you have one free, you can even ask for a specific one. And then we can basically allocate a GNA ID and you become part of the directory. So that's really the simple part. So there's no complex things or black magic there. To become a GNA, that's basically it. So another question is like, what are the benefits if you become GNA? So first of all, as I was mentioning, there is a straightforward way on onboarding. As soon as you meet one of the eligibility criteria, registration is quick, it's simple. In the, I would say, next 48 hours, you will get your ID and your ID prefix. Another thing that is important too, we don't force you to have a specific structures for your identifier, meaning that if you want backward compatibility with existing identifier within your namespace, you can still and continue to use that one. The GCV part will be just a prefix. So that means if you have an existing identifiers, you can actually use it and use just prefix the GCVE prefix there. So we don't actually control what you put after. Obviously, Uh, there is some specification regarding the use of character set and so on, but that's basically it. And you can even reallocate or reprefix everything. If you have any historical identifiers, you can allocate, and you can have future, past, and present identifier allocated in as a GNA. Another thing too, it's the publication process, we don't control it. So that means it's the GNA that decides what they published. So that means if you have a specific definition of what constitutes a vulnerability for you, that's totally fine. And what you want to make as information public. So if you're a security researcher, you want to disclose that specific, you have the control of the disclosure process. We are not involved in that part. We just allocate the prefix for you, putting an identifier on your discovery of vulnerabilities. Obviously, it's an easy way to basically get access and onboarding, but we provide best practices. So if at some point in time you want to basically create your own vulnerabilities and so on, there are some best practices that we provide on the website that you can get access to and you can read. And if you feel comfortable with one of the BCPs, and I will go through the different BCPs, then you can follow those one. And it's encouraged, but not mandatory per se. So about BCP, right now we published actually 3 BCP. The first one is pretty straightforward. Is actually the verification signatures for the directory file. So what is it? We published the JSON files which contain all the GNA, including their, for example, API endpoints, website, and so on. But we wanted to be sure that the integrity is respected on that file, so we provide some best practices regarding that. I will come back to that. It's pretty straightforward to follow. Then we have another BCP called the Practical Guide to Vulnerability Handling and Disclosures. This one is, I would say, a supportive document. So it could happen sometimes for some organizations, they don't have a complete CVD process. They don't know which vulnerability handling procedures to follow. There are some standards, some are not accessible, unfortunately, like the ISO standard for vulnerability handling. So we decided to do one, which is basically combinations of the best practices regarding disclosures and handling of vulnerabilities. And I will come back to that later on. And then we recently published a BCP03, which is a decentralized publication standard, which is a BCP to describe how the distributed publications is implemented. We have on the session today one of the core developers of Vulnerability Lookup, Cedric, which can even answer questions today, because he implemented that part in the open source software Vulnerability Lookup to support the decentralized publication system. So if you want at some point in time to implement such kind of publication systems and follow the standard, you can ask questions today, or we can even have discussion later on if you want. So going back to the first BCP01, and I think this one is pretty straightforward. So we basically have a digital signatures on the directory file. So the directory files is GCVE JSON files. You can even retrieve the keys from different means to ensure that the key materials are not compromised and so on. And we have a Python client and library to access that files, to verify the signatures, and even to navigate through the directory, like getting the GNA and so on. Why we did that, it's facilitating the development of new tooling, actually using GCVE, and they can rely on that library. For vulnerability lookup, for example, that library is used to review the integrity and to ensure the integrity of the files. So what's the only thing that we ask for there? It's basically tool relying on the GCVE directory should obviously automate these validations. And if there is an issue with integrity, you must raise an alert or abort the workflow if the signature check fails. So that's really one of the BCP that is, I think, quite important if you decide to implement software that is compatible, or at least getting the directory. I mean, verifying the signatures is like easy, do it, and that's, I think, safest for everyone. So that's BCP01. Then we have the BCP02. This one is more like, I would say, a guide document. This one will be, I think, regularly updated. So it's actually a good summary of all the recommendations for software developers, open source project maintainers, organizations. So even if you're not a GNA, I think it's an open document. You can have a look at it. It's really nice because you basically have all the different stages from the discovery of a vulnerability through the resolutions and what are the best practices, or you should handle it and so on. And we organize the document into multiple parts from all the life cycle of vulnerability management, from preparations, receipt, triage, investigation, remediation, until communications. Obviously, why we did that document is when GNA have, like, for example, very small processes regarding coordinated public disclosures and so on, they want to have something more adequate or more complete, then the BCPs serve as a kind of reference for that. So I think it's really a document that is like interesting for GNA, but it's interesting for everyone actually involved in a CVD process. And what we recommend is if you're a GNA, it's good if you adopt those practices described in this guide. If you don't agree with us on some aspect, that's totally fine then. But again, it's up to you to decide what you want to add. So it's really I would say, best practices document that support existing, I would say, use case and so on. Then we have the BCPO3. I think this one is one of the most important one that we recently published. So it's actually describing the model of decentralized publications. It's actually based on one core principle of GCVE, which is that GNA has full control over its own publication process. So we allow GNA to publish different vulnerabilities and so on. And we have a question very often regarding that. Does it mean that multiple GNA can publish similar vulnerabilities? Yes, they can. Why is like that? For different reasons. From our experience, we have seen that not everyone agrees on vulnerabilities, and that's totally fine. It's part of the process. Maybe a security researcher might make different disclosures than the actual vendor one. I know that in some programs and so on, you want to reach consensus. In this case, we don't really mind because it's basically up to the GNA to decide and reaching consensus if they want. So each of them can publish. And that's the model there. Everyone can actually publish their own vulnerabilities disclosures. And then I will go back to that. It's the recipient that can decide who they trust more than the other. So that means if you have a GNA that they trust more on the reliability on the vulnerability disclosure process, it's totally fine for them to just, for example, get the vulnerability from that GNA. So there is no combined GNA vulnerability set. It's basically each GNA are publishing vulnerabilities. I will come back to that and how it's done in the publication aspect. So how does it work? It's very straightforward. You have seen that we have a JSON files, and the GCV directory contains specific field. One specific field is dedicated to the synchronization, decentralized one. It's called GCV pool API. This field is actually the field, REST API or static files, where the client will get for each of the GNA the respective vulnerabilities. The transport mechanism in the standard is purely HTTP. It can be over TLS or not. And that's basically the transport mechanism. So it's really straightforward. The only thing that need to be provided by the GNA is two API endpoints. Those two API endpoints are, I would say, pretty straightforward. You have one that can basically get vulnerabilities on a recent scope. So that means you basically specify a date with some filters, the number of results that you want. Or you have one which is basically retrieving the last vulnerabilities with the different sources and the number of results. So it's the two API endpoints that need to be exposed. In the BCP itself, and you might find it strange, but there's a reason for that, we don't enforce the format of publications. Nevertheless, for the reference implementations, we recommend that the CV record format is used for the publications, which is actually, I would say, the most common format for at least vulnerability descriptions. But in the futures, we will have a BCP describing the format that are exposed by GNA. But currently, the default format is the CV record format version 5, if I'm correct, and that's actually how it works. So that's pretty easy. If now we look at how it works on a principle basis, you see that I took an example where we have here 4 vulnerability lookup instances that are actually running. and all of the vulnerability lookup instances, and I will show you later on the production instance, so I guess you can see how it works, are actually fetching the directory from us or from somewhere else, because even if we are not available, the directory can be fetched from others as long as signature is valid. And the vulnerability lookup is getting that directory, and then is proposing to the owner of the instance to select which GNA they want to fetch data. So for example, in this case, we have some instances which are actually GNA, so that means they are actually publishing, so that means they expose through vulnerability to this famous endpoint, and the other vulnerability instance can say, oh, this one is a GNA, I'm interested in that vulnerabilities, and I pull automatically those vulnerabilities. So we have a directory, but it's up to the organization that are actually pulling data that can decide which vulnerability endpoint and GNA they will trust there. It's very simple. There is no complex things there. It's basically a pure HTTP request, and you just like verify the directory endpoint. So there are many questions and some organization asking us what are the different with other initiatives. So first of all, the GCVE has a set of prefixes that are already pre-allocated. So meaning that the pre-allocations of the CVE ID are done for existing programs. So we have already a prefixes for the GitHub Security Advisory. We have one for the CVE programs, one for UVD. So that means if an existing ID exists, you get automatically a GCVE ID. No need to be GNA for that and so on. That's totally fine. For us, it's important because we want to be sure that we ensure compatibility, interoperability with established systems. But if no existing ID are allocated, then you can basically act completely autonomous and do publications on your own. So you have to see GCV as a complementary framework. We don't compete to any other ID programs, and we will see in the future for sure many other ID identification, which is already the case. If you look even at CISA, for example, they have additional IDs, for example, for industrial control system. They have additional IDs for that. You have CISAF sources that have their own IDs and so on, so which is totally fine. And what we try to do is basically to fill the gap where ID allocations is actually missing. And if they are already existing, we just reserve the prefix. That's basically it. So you really have to see GCV program as a functional equivalent to IANA, especially for prefix allocations, with the additions of the BCP practices to facilitate the coordinations on vulnerability space. So to conclude on this before going to a quick demo about vulnerability lookup and GCVE integrations, GCVE is a complete open program. As you have seen that if you want to become GNA, it's really easy to join. The BCP process is completely open. So that means, for example, you can even do pull requests on our GitHub repositories for making proposals and so on. And we have regular meetings to review the changes and so on. And if it makes sense, we incorporate those changes and so on. So it's really open to the community. We don't have any, I would say, private meetings and so on about how the system works. The system is completely transparent. The only thing is we just control the ID allocation of prefixes. Right now, we have a first implementations of the BCP03, BCP01 in vulnerability lookup and in Python library too. But you will see the code base for that is really simple. So if you want to do that in other tooling, it's pretty straightforward. And if you are GNA, you are actually autonomous for publishing information and so on, and you can basically pull the different information there. Yeah, so if you have any questions or want to become a GNA, you can send an email to info@gcve.eu or gna@gcve.eu if it's really related to GNA. For this project, we are having funding from our direct funding, so that means we operate it, but we have complementary funding for the original setups through one of the European grants that we have through a program called NG30, which is co-funded by the European Union. Okay, so now what I will do quickly, it's a quick demo of an existing integrations of a vulnerability lookup instance. So what I will do here, I will actually take an example of our own vulnerability lookup instance at Circle. So as you know, vulnerability lookup is a system where we are collecting vulnerabilities from different places. So you see that we have all the different vulnerabilities from different sources. So classical sources like NVD, CVE list, CSAF sources from different organizations and so on. So make a lot of sense. But what you can see there, on the sources, you have an additional one called GNA1, which is Circle. You have a small home next to it. If you click on that part, it's actually the one that we published on our site. So for example, I have two actually vulnerabilities that are allocated under the GCVE one. This one is an interesting one because it's one that is a bit sometimes difficult to publish into standard programs, because this one is one vulnerability is allocated especially to a ransomware group and a specific tooling used by a ransomware group. But in our GCVE, as we as Circle are GNA, we can decide what we want to actually publish there. So in this case, we in vulnerability lookup, we don't make any differentiations beside that the source, in this case, is a GNA. And this instance is actually the standard instance from the GNA1, so which is Circle, having that vulnerabilities. And if you can see for example, the edit aspect and so on, we basically rely on standard tooling. So this one is Vulnogram for editing the vulnerabilities and so on. The only thing is the publishing is done through vulnerability lookup and available through the GCVE distributed mechanism. So if you run, and I will come back to the dashboard of this vulnerability lookup instance, what you can see there, it's basically a registry. So automatically the software itself is able to connect to the registry of GCVE, verifying the integrity of the files, and then you can decide on your side what data you basically get into the system. So that means you basically import the local registry, so the GNA, and you can even sync the organizations. So that means the local GNA, so the local GNA that you have in the registry will become organizations in your structures, and you can even decide. So I will come back on that. So if you have specific GNA there, you can even decide to basically get the GCVE vulnerability disclosed by that GNA by just pulling that. And that's how it works. Is basically you have a vulnerability lookup instance where you can actually decide if you want to get the vulnerability from that GNA. So you see that it's pretty straightforward. So it's really integrated into the systems. And really what we want to provide is resilience. So that we have resilience in the case of publication and so on. So I think it's, for us, important to have a very simple system that can work out of the box with the existing vulnerability disclosure process, and basically act as a complement. You can even, for example, publish existing vulnerabilities and even, for example, make fork of vulnerabilities. So, for example, if you have like vulnerabilities that are publishing in one way, you want to add additional information. So you have, for example, specific metadata, analysis, and so on. You can automatically publish that as a GNA too. So that could be valuable for the community too, to publish such kind of information there. So for the, I would say, presentations and quick demo, that's basically it. If you are curious about the GCVE program, so we basically have a lot of details on our website. So with the about part, all the BCP, as I was mentioning, are actually published on the website. And if you have any request specific demands, or you want us to basically discuss specific topic on vulnerability disclosures and so on, don't hesitate to contact us. Or if you want to become a GNA, it's pretty straightforward. You can just contact GNA at GCVE.eu, and we will do the allocations based on the principle that are described in these presentations. Now what I can do is I can look at questions. So if you have any questions regarding the models, if some of my colleagues want to add some additional information, they are more than welcome to. I see that there's maybe one question already. Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So Fred with Triple Tree mentioned that the BCP.02 is inspired between different standards. which is exactly that. So that means it's basically best practices. So I mean, it's in the field you have those kind of different, I would say, standards. Our problem is, for example, for the ISO standards, they are not publicly available and accessible. But for example, what we wanted to do is to have public document describing the process. So we basically map what we do as Circle as a CVD process. So it's basically like you said, I think Fred is correct. It's basically a way to have a practical implementation for a GNA for doing this thing. The other question is that a concrete answer and definition of the vulnerability base mentioned, European vulnerability database? Yes. So the UVD database, which is set up by ENISA, it's actually what they have to do within the directive for the NIS2 directive. We are actually actively collaborating with ENISA on different aspects, and especially that the UVD database and systems is actually relying on vulnerability lookup for information and so on. And we have some project with them regarding UVD allocation and so on. And we have a question from Johannes. So if you want, I can unmute you.
Yes. So first of all, let me just thank you for the initiative. I think that's really an awesome idea. I think it's badly needed. And yeah, I applaud you for doing this. One question that I have, and I think based on the loose design that you have, I already know the answer. You don't seem to take a lot of control over the system. So do you have any ideas how to deal with bad players? Because I mean, we see that from time to time that certain companies become CNAs to then basically just not publish.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it's something from the early beginning when we started. And I remember some of my with my colleague we had discussion about what do we do with, I would say, loosey GNA or vendor that are not properly publishing information and so on, or I would say not playing the games properly. So one of the goal that we have, and that's more like a kind of organic growth for the GCV project, what you want to do is to actually score them. So that means, in addition to the directory, plan that we have is to actually see the quality of information. So for example, I see that you are from SUSE. I know that you are providing a lot of good information and so on. I would have a high level of trust on SUSE, what you actually provide, the vulnerabilities are well described and so on. Sometimes you have some vendors that I would say like don't disclose that much or tend to retain some information, and basically the security researchers are frustrated and publishing on their own. So for example, in this case, even if we don't control the GNA, as a directory, nothing blocks us to basically score GNA. So that means, for example, to set a weight, saying that this one is like, for example, known to produce and follow this PCP and these best practices, and this one is a bit loosey, and so on. But really, initially, we really don't want to block the system because what we have seen in the past for us is some provider of data and vulnerabilities information are super interesting, but they are not eligible for those different programs for different reasons, because they are just, a single security researcher, but maybe even very active, having a GitHub account with all the vulnerabilities, but they can actually easily publish those. So we want to cover that space too. So that's why we are a bit, I would say, open and flexible on that aspect, but you are totally right, Johannes. I mean, I know that there are a lot of organizations that don't play the rules, and what we want to do is basically to find a way to evaluate those. But if you have more points, don't hesitate.
No, thank you very much. I lowered my hand, but I still see it in my interface. I don't know why. So if it's still up for you, it's not by intention.
Okay, no worries, no worries. Thanks a lot for the question, by the way. Very interesting, and thanks for the work that you do on vulnerability disclosure too. It's very good too. And is there any other questions from other participants? Stefan from Swisscom has a very good questions about the resilience. So yes, exactly. For mirror caching, it's really part of the roadmap. So the model that we have in BCP03 that I was mentioning, there's an API and a static model. So one of the plan, and that's exactly that. So if one of the GNA like start to publish quite a lot, then completely disappear, or the company get merged and then they don't care anymore about those vulnerabilities, we can basically mirror the API endpoints and keep a cache of those and replace it even in the directory. If we see that one GNA is not actually publishing through the API anymore. So that's why if you look at the BCPO tree, we have two models. We have an API model and a static model. That's actually that. No, it is in the standard. No, as GCVE, we need to basically have an active cache on that. So it's the early beginning. So for us, but it's really straightforward to do that. Okay, but very good question, Stefan. François from Ombrizoni has a question about, is a CP vendor name a hard requirement for vendors to become a GNA? No, it's not. It's not a hard requirement. It's just to facilitate some of the collections if needed, if there's a single vendors. But there's not a hard requirement there. No, no, not at all. If it's I would say, written on the website about CP names and so on, it's maybe we should clarify that, but it's not a hard requirement at all. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate.
I raised a hand here, and it's not Johannes Steglitz from SUSE, but it's Johannes from ENISA.
Many Johannes. Welcome,
So
Johannes.
there's the hand that does not go down.
Okay.
My question is simply, or I don't know, complicated around this question of synchronization between actually obtaining a CVE identifier while assigning a GCVE identifier. So in case you want to ensure that there is a GCVE under GNA 0 under the CVE program, what would be the most efficient way that you do this? Would you use the GCVE mechanism, and can you still assign a CVE under your GNA name, and or would that be a duplicate, or how would you ensure this is working appropriately? Because actually we want to have as little identifiers as necessary.
That's totally right. So for that, it's the system allow it. Know that you ask the questions. I think maybe we need a BCP to explain the process, but technically the following. So if you're actual CNA, you will actually use a GCVE-O prefixes for allocating the CV IDs. If you don't have any CV ID, if you're a CNA, you have already a pool. So that means nothing blocks you to have the prefix with 0 for the CVE when the CVE ID is published. But what we will recommend, but it's just a recommendation, it's up to the organizations, to actually allocate the GCVE prefix of the GNA with the same ID that is actually allocated as a CNA. So like that, you basically have an easy way to find back the other one, especially that for GNA that are CNA. So that's why what we want to do in the directory, we might add a specific flag saying that, okay, that GNA is actually a CNA too, to facilitate that. No, the question is more like for others that are requesting a CVE IDs, but pre-published or at least already published as a GCVE, then it's, I would say, up to the GNA to decide. But nothing blocks them to basically have a prefix, which is the local one. And then if they allocate a CV ID, they can use a GCV ID. What is maybe different, and that's something that I think I would keep in mind too, the problem is you might have updates that are appearing on the source of the vendor, so the GNA, for example, but not in the CVE publication later on. So it's actually the same situation with CSAF. You might have data in the CSAF sources that you might not have in the CVE ones, and vice versa. It could happen on both sides too. So to limit that, what we obviously recommend is to ensure that the process of the GNA for publications is like streamlined. But as far as I know from my experience, I've seen that it's already like not always in line between the two or multiple programs. So in this case, I would say that the GCV IDs for non-CNA, if you don't have any ID allocated already for CV, you use your ID. And then later on, you prefix with the GCV or over prefix for the CV ID allocation, and you keep the other one. But in the worst case, you basically get two IDs. but you still have the CVID used as a pivot reference point, like we have in vulnerability lookup and other tools. But I think, Johannes, you're right on this process. Maybe we will might make a BCP, and I might need you there for review and improvement if needed. Thank you. Okay, so I'm looking at the other question. So Stefan from Swisscom mentions, what about duplicate between GNA or they should be handled? Yes. So indeed, and that's actually a classical problem. Right now, there's the duplicate because in the publication process of CVE, and this one is you have, for example, rejection of CVE ID sometimes. So if you pull the CVE ID database, you'll see that you have like some rejected IDs. You might have conflictual publication and so on. The goals in these systems is if you have even disagreement in publications, it will be actually published. So that means if you have two GNA that are actually talking about the same vulnerabilities, they will publish their own vulnerabilities, and then they can reference back the specific GCVE if they want. The reason behind is the following, and that's something, it's a classical problem, I would say. You might have vendors that are publishing something that's not in line with what the security researcher discover. So I would say in this case, the GNA or each of the GNA have the responsibility. So that means you might have even two vulnerability ones. So what we will recommend, and I think it's something that we recommend for GNA there, is to basically, if they know that there's a disambiguity or conflict between two publications, to reference back that they have a conflict of publication on another one, and that's it. So that means the system will be. So if you trust specific sources when you pull the data, you just get the one that you trust. If you basically pull all the GNA with the different, I would say, versions of those vulnerabilities, you will basically get two vulnerabilities with the reference back of the disputed one, I would say. So that's basically how to solve such kind of problems. But there are other strategies that we are maybe planning there. Johannes, you have another questions, maybe?
Yeah, related. I mean, this is really one of the most important questions around this. Multi-party disclosure, one library, many downstream vendors. I don't know, everybody assigning their own ID. What is the process? How do we kind of scope this to handle this, that actually the multi-party collaboration actually works in the end when we all talk about the same vulnerability but cannot pinpoint it with, let's say, one core identifier that initially was expected CVE to be helpful with that specific subject?
Yeah, true. That's a very good example. I think Stefan summarized it very well in this on his own replies there. It's actually the willingness of the GNA to work together. I mean, if I look at foundation perspective in the open source world, for example, Apache foundations, Eclipse foundations, Linux foundation, and so on, they all work together. So if, for example, you have an upstream library managed by, I don't know, Apache foundations and a downstream managed by Linux foundations, obviously they will work together if they publish things, and that's already the case. It happens sometimes that, and it's, for example, it's the case of Red Hat. Red Hat might have a package with specific software then, and they reference back in the CSAF other IDs that are the ID of the downstream libraries. So I don't see there any problems. The only problem is actually the one that doesn't want to work together. Now we have some ongoing projects with different open source contributors and foundation there to actually expand maybe the format. So now we have to see if it's part of the CV record format or extension there for the GNA to actually reference back vulnerabilities, because we have already the issue with the bundling of vulnerabilities. So as you might know, Johannes, we have in vulnerability lookup the bundle approach where we bundle multiple CV together because sometimes they are documented in either a single one, but you have multiple ones describing this one. For example, a patch is including multiple CVEs or vulnerabilities disclosed. So it's exactly the same kind of problem. So it might not be impossible that we extend a bit the format in the futures to allow these kind of things where you say we have cross-reference across GNA and the vulnerabilities. As they have IDs, as long as you know and they work together, so that was the point of Stefan, and I think it's a very good point. If they work together, then you can cross-refer them. If they don't, it's totally fine. Why we did that approach is the following. We have seen in some cases where nothing gets published due to the interlocking. So that means at the end, no one wants to publish because it's a complete mess. So we want to be sure that at least someone is publishing the vulnerability to at least disclose to the community there is an issue. We don't know at which scale, we don't know at which impact on the vulnerabilities, but that's actually the model. So that's why we wanted to have something that at least GNA can publish. Even if you don't agree with them, you have the information. So that's the model behind. But obviously, BCP will be updated. We are at the beginning of the initiative. And we might change a bit the format or facilitate this kind of things where you have like downstream things or you have you have a complete supply chain issue there. You might have to describe through different GNAs, different vulnerabilities. I hope it answers your questions. And don't have answer to everything. So it's really, and as I was mentioning, it's the first time we do such kind of presentation. So it might give us even some good idea of what we need to improve there. Any other questions? Don't hesitate to unmute yourself if you want to ask questions. So as I said, the session will be recorded, is recorded, and then we will publish it online. But if there's no more questions, I would like to thank everyone that participated, and all the questions were super good. I see maybe some of the additional one. Yeah, I got another question in private chat regarding numbering. Yeah, so this question about Harmony Sync from EUVD and MyTrace CVE. But I think it's something that we were discussing with Johannes recently to facilitate, for example, the publication of a matrix table of EUVD IDs and their allocated CVE ID to basically inject it into our different tools, especially vulnerability lookup. And obviously, an entity can be both CNA and GNA, and that's already the case, yeah. That makes sense. Okay, is there any other questions before we close down the sessions? No more questions? Great. Thanks a lot for joining. Thanks a lot. And we hope that we will get some new GNA soon following our discussion. Thank you very much. Take care and see you soon. Bye-bye.